So today we start a new worship series as we begin our Lenten journey following Jesus on his transformative path to Jerusalem. On Wednesday, we celebrated Ash Wednesday, remembering that we are to dust, and to dust we will return, and that God is love, and to God's love we will return. One of the texts on Wednesday was Luke 9:51, where Jesus turns his face towards Jerusalem and begins his journey towards the cross. Our scriptures during Lent will be set during this journey to Jerusalem, and I think it's important to place the stories we will encounter in this context. Jesus is traveling from Capernaum, which is located on the Sea of Galilee, to Jerusalem. He does his ministry along the way, but he will ultimately be handed over to be crucified for crimes he didn't commit. As he begins this journey, he sends out messengers ahead of him to prepare for his arrival. But when they enter a Samaritan village, the villagers refuse to welcome him because he was determined to go to Jerusalem. This is interesting to note since it is a Samaritan he uses in today's parable to demonstrate who acts as a neighbor. Further on in his journey, the religious leaders begin to criticize him. But first, we encounter a legal expert, a scribe of the Hebrew Scriptures, who has questions for Jesus. And before we dive into today's stories, I want to share how amazing it is that we get to ask questions. Jesus never tells people exactly what to believe, but instead he welcomes questions and a questioning spirit. As people of faith, we get to have that same questioning spirit. We get to wonder, we get to discern, and we get to discover what the scriptures reveal to us about God, ourselves, and our neighbors. And our two stories today are about that very topic, our relationship to God and to our neighbor. Most of us know the stories of the Good Samaritan and Mary and Martha. The Good Samaritan is usually a feel-good story about helping others, or maybe a simple admonishment or guilt trip for not stopping to help stranded motorists. The Mary and Martha story is usually simplified in a way that pits Mary against Martha, and causes us to focus on the better way of doing discipleship. Today, we're going to look for a deeper understanding of these texts. First, I think it's important to note that there is no mention of the word good in this text in regards to the Samaritan. At some point in Christian church history, the parable began to be known by this name, most likely based on how it was being interpreted. It's now a common metaphor for any person who does good works, like rescuing or helping out a needy stranger. We even have hospitals and nursing homes named after this parable. But the text doesn't say anything about the Samaritan being good or the priest or the Levite being bad. Instead, the parable is really about Jesus being put to the test by this legal expert and answering the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus, in his way, actually encourages the legal expert to answer his own question. His first question is about what he must do to gain eternal life, and Jesus asks him what is written in the law. Jesus is probably thinking, well, you're the expert, tell me what it says. So the legal expert responds with, love God and love neighbor. This is from Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. And Jesus is like, good job, A+, you are right. Go and do this and you will live. But the legal expert couldn't let it end there because he really needed to know who his neighbor is. See, he needed to make sure he was doing it right. And I'm guessing he didn't actually want to treat everyone like they were his neighbor or be a neighbor to everyone. I can identify with that, and I'm sure you can too. Jesus, could you maybe narrow down or clarify this concept of neighbor? Because there are some people I just really don't want to love. I really just want to know who is in and who is out. Where is the boundary or the line to who I must love? So as Jesus does, he responds with a story. A man is robbed and beaten and left on this road between Jericho and Jerusalem. A priest walks by, sees the injured man, and moves to the other side. A Levite walks by, sees the injured man, and moves to the other side. A Samaritan walks by, sees the injured man, and is moved with compassion toward the man to take care of him. He even takes him to an inn and pays the innkeeper to take care of him. And Jesus asks, which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves? And the legal expert responds, the one who demonstrated mercy toward him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Now, in our culture, we often encounter groups of three when we tell a joke. A priest, a rabbi, and a minister walk into a bar. Well, the legal expert would have expected to hear something similar. A priest, a Levite, and a scribe. He and those hearing the story would have expected the hero of the story to be the scribe, which is the legal expert. He was expecting himself to be lifted up as the neighbor. How shocking it must have been to hear a Samaritan as the third person, the hero. Can you imagine? This is not the answer that they expected. They must have been angry. And you might wonder, well, why is this so shocking, or why would they be angry? The hostility between Israelites and Samaritans was centuries long and had religious and ethnic elements. This hostility dated back to when the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians and the people were exiled. The Assyrians brought in outsiders to populate the region of Samaria. When the Israelites returned after the exile, they did not recognize the Samaritans as descendants of Abraham, as part of their family. They drew a line of who was in and who was out. And the Samaritans, they were out. But even in the Hebrew scriptures in Leviticus 19:33 through 34, the concept of neighbor is already expanded to the immigrant in your midst. When immigrants live in your land with you, you must not cheat them. Any immigrant who lives with you must be treated as if they were one of your citizens. But this long-standing hostility and feud would have led the hearers of this parable to be shocked that the Samaritan is the one who proves to be the neighbor, as the source where you might learn love from. Again, the legal expert is wanting a black and white answer to who is in and to who is out, for the difference between good and evil, instead of knowing God and God's mercy. When we think the law is the gospel, we glorify and seek refuge in rules and boundaries. But when we seek a relationship with God, we are moved by compassion. The legal expert can't even say the Samaritan is the one who is the neighbor. He says the one who showed mercy. He recognizes that mercy, that compassion, is the true mark of the neighbor in this story. And I want to go back in the story to where the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan are all moved. They all respond to seeing the injured man. The priest and the Levite respond by moving to the other side of the road. The story doesn't say why. There is no criticism or judgment offered. But the Samaritan is moved by compassion towards the man. The Samaritan must know God and God's love to respond to the hurting of another person and be moved by compassion, because God is a God of compassion. Remember, Jesus is moved by compassion to heal the sick. Likewise, the Samaritan is moved by compassion. He is connected to God. Jesus widens the boundaries of neighbor for the legal expert. He tears down the walls and includes more and more people in the category of neighbor. The neighbor is probably who you least expect it to be. The person you would never expect to receive mercy from or show mercy to. Amy Jill Levine says, we should think of ourselves as the person in the ditch and then ask, is there anyone from any group about whom we'd rather die than acknowledge she offered help or he showed compassion? More, is there any group whose members might rather die than help us? If so, then we know how to find the modern equivalent to the Samaritan. The Narrative Lectionary podcast put it this way: we learn what mercy looks like by seeing our enemy perform it on us. And tearing down the boundaries as to who our neighbor is risky. God's love and compassion is risky. It moves in scary places, and it goes beyond societal norms and expectations. And it manifests itself in ways that we don't expect. It causes us to cross the borders we've erected that create communities and neighborhoods full of people just like us. Being a neighbor does not just equal doing good, but it involves identifying with those outside our groups, the oppressed, the other, the least. You might be wondering, well, how does the Mary and Martha story connect to this? One might say that the Samaritan is praised and honored for serving another person and meeting their needs. He was open to being distracted on his journey and stopping to help someone. But then Martha, she's criticized for being distracted and not devout like Mary. Both the Samaritan and Martha are engaged in acts of service, care, and hospitality. But the Samaritan is lifted up as the example, and Martha is told she just doesn't get it. I think the difference is a matter of the heart. The Samaritan responds out of compassion due to his connection with God. Martha complains that Mary isn't helping her. She's just going through the motions, doing what she thinks is the right thing to do, but not doing it out of an act of worship or connection with Jesus. These stories told together encourage us to be connected to God and give us permission to choose to follow the life-giving Jesus distractions, releasing us from doing good things for the wrong reasons. We no longer have to do the minor laws or rules if they keep us from doing the essence of the commandments: love God and love neighbor. This brings us back to the legal expert's initial question: what must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven? He was looking for certainty. Martha was doing the right thing with the wrong motive. We are often looking for a checklist to win God's mercy. Knowing the right words or the right things to do doesn't mean that we understand God's heart. And we can't earn God's mercy. It is freely given. We are called to respond to God's mercy by loving God and loving our neighbor. I encourage you throughout this Lenten season to spend time in God's presence, to align your heart and your actions with God's heart, and be prepared to expand the boundaries of God's love to new and risky places. Will you pray with me? God of love that has no boundaries, help us to be in relationship with you. Make our heart like yours, that we may be ready to be moved by compassion to new and risky places, extending your mercy to all your people. Amen.